The wind had teeth, and it was using them. Eli squinted against the gray light. The plain stretched out in every direction, a boundless ocean of winter-dead grass and muddy earth just beginning to show the faintest hint of spring green. It was a liar's green, promising warmth that was still weeks away. The sky was a low, heavy sheet of iron, threatening a snow that was too late in the season to be welcome. His mare, a sturdy buckskin, blew out a hard breath, the steam torn away by the wind. Eli pulled his collar higher. He was cold, but it was a familiar cold. It was the other chill, the one that lived in his gut, that made his hands tighten on the reins. He was hauling supplies, sacks of flour, salt, beans, and 2 tins of kerosene, all balanced carefully on the pack mule that plodded faithfully behind him. He was headed to the McPherson homestead, an isolated scratch of land tucked into the canyon's 2 days' ride from here. He did this run every 6 weeks. It was work. It was quiet. It kept him out of towns. Towns had people, people had laws, and laws had ropes. The memory rose up unbidden, as it always did when he was alone with the wind. It wasn't the wind he heard, but the sound a rope makes when it takes the full weight of a man. A sharp, sickening snap, followed by a silence heavier than the sky. He saw the face, young, barely old enough to shave, eyes wide with a terror that Eli had put there. He'd been wrong. He'd found out 2 days later, long after the body was in the ground and the bounty was in his pocket. The man had been innocent. Eli's jaw clenched. The guilt was a physical thing, a stone in his belly that the wind couldn't touch. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of riding, 2 years of avoiding his own reflection in a saloon mirror, 2 years of this, hauling supplies, fixing fences, moving from one ranch to another, never staying long enough for anyone to ask his name twice. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of a world he no longer fit in. The mare stumbled, pulling him from the memory. He soothed her with a low word, his eyes scanning the ground. They were nearing a small creek, a jagged cut in the prairie lined with stunted cottonwoods and thick brush. The animals needed water, and he needed to get off the horse. He dismounted, his joints stiff. The air near the water was stiller, the banks high enough to break the wind. He led the horses down the muddy incline. As the mare dipped her head, Eli's gaze caught on something that wasn't right. A branch, thick as his arm, was snapped on a chokecherry bush. It was a fresh break, the wood inside white and wet. He looked closer. The mud at the creek's edge was a mess, not just the clean prints of deer or coyote, but a churned, panicked scattering of boot prints, large prints, deep and heavy, and something else. He knelt, his gloved finger tracing the edge of a smaller print. No, not a print, a drag mark. The smear of a heel. Digging in. Fighting. A cold that had nothing to do with the wind washed over him. He stood slowly, his hand moving not to his pistol, but to the hilt of the knife sheathed on his belt. It was quieter. He scanned the brush. "Hello?" he called out, his voice low. The only answer was the rush of the water and the nicker of the mule. He followed the marks. They led away from the water, up the opposite bank, toward a cluster of boulders and rocky outcroppings that looked like a stack of forgotten dinner plates. There was a dark spot on a flat stone. He touched it. Blood, still tacky. He drew the knife. He moved without a sound, a lifetime of tracking prey, both animal and human, guiding his feet. He eased around the largest boulder, his eyes straining in the dim light of the overhang. At first, he saw nothing, just shadow and rock. Then, a flicker of movement in the deepest cleft, a space no bigger than a coffin. He saw eyes, white and wide, reflecting the dull light. A sound, like a trapped bird. A gasp, a scrape of stone. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The words felt thin. A figure scrambled back, deeper into the dark. It was a woman. No, a girl. Maybe. Hard to tell. She was wedged as far back as she could get, trying to make herself part of the rock. Eli sheathed his knife, holding his hands up, palms out. "I've got water. I'm just here." He stepped back, giving her space, and walked to his mare. He unhooked his canteen, uncorked it, and set it on the ground. about 10 feet from the rock. He did the same with a piece of jerky from his saddlebag. "There for you," he said to the shadow. He backed away and sat on a fallen log, pulling his hat low, deliberately turning his gaze toward his horses. He sat there for a long time. The silence was absolute. He could feel her watching him. He could feel the terror rolling off her in waves. Finally, a sound. The scrape of rock, the rustle of clothing. He didn't turn. He heard a small, choked sob as she grabbed the canteen, and the sound of frantic, desperate swallowing. Then, the scrape as she retreated. He waited. An hour passed. The iron sky began to darken. "I have to make a fire," he said, not turning. "It'll be dark soon, and cold." No answer. He went about the work, his movements slow and deliberate, telegraphing every action. He gathered dry twigs from under the brush, cut shavings from a piece of kindling with his knife, and struck a match. He built the fire small and tight, just enough to give heat. He set up his camp. He unpacked the mule, fed the horses, and started a pot of coffee. The smell of the coffee and the wood smoke filled the small clearing. When the coffee was hot, he poured a cup and set it near the canteen. He took his own cup and his bedroll and walked to the other side of the fire, a good 20 feet away from her. He sat with his back against a different rock, making it clear he was not coming any closer. "My name is Eli," he said to the fire. The silence stretched. He thought she wouldn't answer. Then, a voice. So quiet, it was barely a sound, cracked with thirst and fear. "Clara." He nodded, though she probably couldn't see it. "Clara," he repeated, just to show he'd heard. He drank his coffee. He ate his own jerky. He watched the flames. He could feel her. She was a bundle of fear, coiled in the dark. He'd seen men in traps make less noise, but he'd never felt a silence so loud. As the light faded completely, he saw her, just for a moment, outlined by the fire. She hadn't moved from the cleft. She was just a shape. "You need to get warm," he said. "That rock will steal all your heat." She said nothing. He sighed, a plume of white air. He unrolled his spare blanket, a thick wool one. He stood up, walked halfway to her, and tossed it onto the ground near the canteen. "It's clean," he said. Then he retreated to his own side of the fire. He settled into his bedroll, pulling his hat over his eyes. But he didn't sleep. He listened. He heard her, after another hour, creeping out, the sound of the blanket being pulled. She didn't go back into the rock. She huddled on the far side of the clearing, as far from him as she could get while still feeling the fire's meager warmth. She was curled in the blanket, a small, dark lump. He pretended to be asleep. He listened to her breathing, shallow and fast. Every time the fire popped, she flinched, a sharp intake of air. She didn't sleep, neither did he. His mind drifted, not to the hanging this time, but to her. He'd seen her more clearly when she'd reached for the canteen. Her face was a ruin of bruises, one eye swollen shut. Her clothing was a collection of torn rags, but it was her hands and her feet. She was barefoot. Her feet were cut, swollen, and caked in black, drying mud, and her wrists. When she'd grabbed the blanket, he'd seen them, raw, red, and bloody. Rope burns, deep ones. Not from a few hours of being tied, from days, weeks. He closed his eyes. He knew what kind of men did that. He knew what kind of world allowed it. It was the same world that let an innocent man hang. Clara watched the man named Eli. He was a shape on the other side of the fire. He was big, and he was quiet, and he hadn't hurt her. Yet, the blanket smelled of horse and wool and smoke. It was the first warm thing she had touched in days. She shivered, though the wool was thick. The cold was inside her. The firelight made the shadows dance. The shadows looked like men. They always looked like men. She squeezed her eyes shut. And she was back. Not in the cold, but in the heat, the stifling, stinking heat of the outpost. It was a trading post, but it traded in things that shouldn't be traded. Whiskey, guns, women. She remembered the smoke from their cigars, the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap liquor. She remembered the big one, the one called Subtle, with the beard that was stained yellow. He'd looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of buying. Bought her fair and square, he'd boasted to the others. Her uncle in Missouri sold her paper. Debt payment. She wasn't a person. She was a debt. They tied her. At night, they tied her to the post of the bed, like an animal. She'd fought, at first. That was how she got the bruises. After a while, she just stopped. Fighting only made it worse. The rope was a constant, biting into her wrists. A reminder that she was property. Then, 3 nights ago, the storm. A wild, angry thunderhead that had rolled in and torn the sky open. The wind had ripped a part of the roof off the lean-to. In the chaos, in the shouting and the rain, with Subtle and his men trying to save their horses. She had run. She hadn't grabbed shoes. She hadn't grabbed food. She just ran. She ran into the dark, the cold mud sucking at her bare feet, the rain washing the blood and grime from her face. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. She'd been hiding for 2 days, moving only at night, eating roots she didn't recognize, her fear a constant, metallic taste in her mouth, until he'd found her. Eli. He was different. He was quiet. He hadn't tried to touch her. He hadn't even looked at her for more than a second. He'd given her food and water and a blanket. And then he had moved away. It was this, his distance, that confused her more than anything. Subtle would have hit her. The others would have laughed. This one, he just sat. She didn't trust him. She couldn't. Trust was a luxury for people who owned themselves. But he was her only warmth in a world that had gone cold. She pulled the blanket tighter, her raw wrists screaming at the movement. She watched his sleeping form, and she waited for the dawn. The dawn came slow and gray. Eli was already up, tending the horses. He'd made more coffee. He didn't look at her when she stirred. "I'm heading for the settlement," he said, his voice flat in the morning air. "It's in the mountains. 2, maybe 3 days' walk." He packed his gear. He didn't offer her a ride. He didn't ask her to come. "You can't stay here," he said, cinching the strap on the mule. "Them that did this, they'll be looking." She knew. She'd been looking over her shoulder every second. He held out his hand, not to her, but holding something. It was a pair of his own wool socks, thick, gray. "Put these on," he said. "It's better than nothing. Then wrap them with strips from that spare saddle blanket. It'll keep your feet from tearing apart." She stared at the socks. He set them on the ground, near where she'd slept, and walked away. She did as he said. Her hands shook as she pulled the socks over her raw feet. The wool was scratchy, but it was a shield. She tore strips from the blanket he'd pointed to, her fingers clumsy. He didn't watch her. He was busy with his horses. "Can you ride?" he asked, his back to her. "No," she whispered. The word was sharp. To ride meant to be behind him, to be close, to be trapped. He nodded, as if he'd expected it. "All right, we'll walk." He offered her the last of his jerky. She took it, her eyes on the ground, and so they began. He walked ahead, leading the mare and the mule. She followed 10 paces behind. The walking was agony. Every step was a fresh pain, a new fire lancing up her legs. The makeshift bindings helped, but the ground was uneven, rocky, and wet. She stumbled often, but she never made a sound. She kept her eyes on the mud-caked heels of his boots and put one foot in front of the other. They walked all day. He stopped twice, for water. He never hurried her. He just waited, his patience as vast and empty as the prairie around them. He seemed to be listening to a sound she couldn't hear, his gaze always on the horizon, or in the past. That night, the camp routine was the same. He built the fire. He gave her food. This time, hot beans from a can, which she ate like a starving animal. He set up his bedroll on one side, and she huddled in her blanket on the other. The cold was worse tonight. The wind was back, and the stars were sharp. Cold chips of ice in a black sky. The land was sparse, the trees stunted and bent. It was a brutal, unforgiving place. It felt like home. She was watching the fire, her body one dull, throbbing ache. When he moved, she flinched, pulling her blanket tighter. He wasn't coming toward her. He'd just picked up his canteen and a small, clean rag from his saddlebag. He walked over, not to her, but to where she sat and knelt. She scrambled back. "Don't!" "Your wrists," he said, his voice low and steady. "They're festering. I can smell it from here." "You'll lose the hands if they're not cleaned." She stared at him. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hands, which she had hidden in the folds of the blanket. "Give them here, Clara." It was the first time he'd used her name since the creek. Slowly, trembling, she held out her left hand. He didn't just grab it. He was gentle. He poured a small amount of precious water onto the rag and began to clean the wound. She hissed, a sharp intake of breath as the water hit the raw, infected flesh. The rope had worn grooves into her skin. His hands were rough, calloused, scarred, but his touch was steady. He cleaned away the grime and the pus. His movements efficient, practiced. He was silent. A tear, hot and sharp, escaped her eye and tracked down her bruised cheek. It wasn't just the pain. It was the touch. It had been so long since a hand had touched her without hurt. He'd touched her like she was a person, not a thing, like she was a wound that needed mending. He finished the first wrist, and she, without being asked, offered the other. He cleaned it just as carefully. Then he took 2 more strips of clean cloth from his bag and bound them. Not tight like the ropes, but softly, to keep them clean. He finished, and he still didn't look at her face. He just capped his canteen. "It'll be better in the morning," he said. He stood up and walked back to his side of the fire, back to his own world, leaving her with her pain, which felt, just for a moment, a little less cold. She watched him settle in. He was a man of ghosts. She could see it. He was haunted, just as she was. They were 2 broken things, sitting in the dark, under a sky that didn't care, in a wilderness that was waiting to swallow them both. The fire popped, a spark flying up to join the cold stars. It was sparse, it was bleak, but the small flame in the center of their camp, like the life in both of them, was not yet dead. The new silence between them was as brittle as a skim of ice on the creek. He had cleaned her wrists, and in doing so, had breached some invisible wall. She still walked behind him, but the distance had shrunk from 10 paces to 5. She watched the back of his neck, the way the dark hair curled over his collar. She watched his hands on the reins, calloused and sure. They were the same hands that had been so careful with her wounds, a gentleness she still couldn't understand. It made her suspicious. Kindness was a currency she'd never been paid in, and she didn't know the exchange rate. "Why are you out here?" Her voice was a rusty hinge, and Eli flinched. He hadn't heard her speak more than 1 word at a time. He didn't turn. "Just am." They walked on. The plains were giving way to rolling foothills, the ground rising toward the sharp, snow-capped teeth of the mountains. "That's not an answer," she said, her voice a little stronger. He sighed, the sound a plume of white air. "I'm haulin' supplies." "You don't talk like a supply man, and you don't act like one." He stopped, turning to face her. His eyes were gray, the color of the sky, and just as cold. "And what do you know about supply men, Clara?" She shrank back, his gaze too heavy. "Nothing. You're quiet. You move like you're hunting something, or something's hunting you." His face shuddered. He turned away and started walking again. "You should save your breath for the climb." But she had broken the dam, and now the questions leaked out. She needed to know. She needed to place him in a world that, for her, was made up only of monsters and victims. He was neither. "Why not live in town?" she pushed, following at his heels. "There's a town, right? You said a settlement." "Towns don't suit me." "Why?" "Too many people." "Too many laws?" she asked, the words sharp. He stopped again. This time he didn't turn. His whole body went rigid. "Something like that." "What did you do?" she whispered. Eli's hand went to the mule's lead rope, his knuckles white. "I've done things I'm not proud of." He said it to the mule, not to her. Things that a town wouldn't understand. Things I don't understand." He said nothing more, and she knew she had hit the bone. He was a man with a past. He was a man with ghosts. He was, she realized, with a cold pit in her stomach, just like her. Her feet were in agony. The wool socks and blanket wraps were stiff with dried blood, and the rough terrain was a new torture with every step. She stumbled, a sharp rock turning under her makeshift boot, and a cry, thin and sharp, escaped her lips. She fell to one knee. Eli was at her side in an instant, but he didn't touch her. He just stood over her, his shadow falling across her. "Let me see," he said. "It's fine," she hissed, pulling away, trying to stand. The pain lanced up her leg, and the world went gray at the edges. "You're lying. You've been limping for the last hour." He knelt, and, before she could protest, he was unwrapping the bloody rags from her foot. She gasped as the air hit it. The skin was rubbed raw, one cut deep and black with dirt. "You can't walk," he said, his voice flat. "I can," she insisted, her voice trembling. "No, you can't." He stood up and looked at her, not with pity, but with a hard, assessing gaze. "You'll slow us down. That foot will fester, same as your wrists, and I can't fix it out here. We get caught in a storm. We're both dead." He walked to his mare and untied the bedroll from behind the saddle. "You ride." "No." The word was immediate, automatic. "I'm not asking," he said, but his voice was still quiet. "I won't ride with you," she said, her eyes wide with a new panic. The thought of being that close, of his arms on either side of her, of being trapped. He seemed to understand. He didn't argue. He just nodded, his face grim. He adjusted the stirrup. "Then you ride the mare. I'll walk." She stared at him. "And the supplies?" "The mule can carry them. I'll walk." This was worse. It was a kindness so large. It felt like a trap. To take his horse, to make him walk. "I can't, Clara," he said, and his voice was rough with an impatience that had nothing to do with her. "We are wasting daylight, and there's weather coming in." He pointed to the south, where the sky was a deep, bruised purple. "I'm not them. I'm not subtle. I'm just a man trying to get to the mountains. And now I'm trying to get you to the mountains. Get on the horse." She looked at his outstretched hand, not offering to lift her, but offering the rein. She was shaking, but the thought of another step on her burning foot made her sick. She took the rein. He put his hands together for a step, and she put her good foot in his grasp and hauled herself up. She settled in the saddle, her hands gripping the horns so hard her knuckles were white. He looked up at her. He adjusted her bloody foot in the stirrup, his touch brief. "Don't fall off." He took the mare's bridle and the mule's lead, and they started off again. He walked, and she rode. She watched the top of his hat, the broad set of his shoulders, and she felt a shame so deep it almost choked her. They traveled that way for hours. The wind picked up, a high, mournful sound that clawed at them. The purple sky ate the gray, and the first stinging pellets of sleet began to hit. Within an hour, it was a full-blown storm. The sleet turned to a blinding white curtain of snow. The wind howled, a living thing that wanted to tear the flesh from their bones. Eli stopped, pulling the animals into the lee of a rock. He was covered in snow, his shoulders hunched. "We can't keep going," he yelled over the wind. "We need shelter, now!" He pulled her down from the mare, her legs, numb with cold, buckled. He caught her, his arms snapping around her waist, holding her up. "Stay on your feet, Clara!" The contact was a shock, his body hard and warm even through their soaked clothes. She pushed away, stumbling, and he let her go, his face tight. He scanned the whiteout. "There," he pointed. She saw nothing, just white. He grabbed the mare's rein. "Stay close. Do not lose sight of me." He plunged into the blizzard, and she followed, her hand on the mule's pack, her head down. The world reduced to the sound of the wind and the dark shape of the man in front of her. He found it, a dark slash in the white, a collapsing lean-to next to a half-buried cabin. It was an old mining claim, long since abandoned. "Get the animals in," he shouted. pushing her toward the lean-to. He fought the cabin door, the wood swollen and frozen, and finally kicked it open. Darkness, the smell of wet rot and animal droppings. Eli pushed her inside. "Get to the back wall." He followed her in, and the slam of the door cut the howl of the wind to a muffled scream. The darkness was absolute. She heard him fumbling in his pack. The scrape of a match? It failed. Another, this one caught. He lit a lantern, and the small, one-room cabin was bathed in a sickly yellow light. It was a ruin. A rusted stove, a broken table, filth everywhere, and hanging from a thick ceiling beam, a length of old, frayed rope. It had been used to hoist gear, its end tied in a crude, functional noose. Clara saw it. The world stopped. The cold, the hunger, the pain in her feet. It all vanished. There was only the rope. She was back at the outpost. She was back in the dark. Suttle's whiskey breath on her face. His hands fumbling with the knot, pulling it tight around her wrist, yanking her to the bedpost. The scrape of the hemp, the bite as it tightened. "So you don't get no ideas. Girl, property stays put." She made a sound, a low, tearing sound from the bottom of her throat. She couldn't breathe. The cabin walls were closing in. The rope was around her neck. "No," she whispered, her hands flying to her throat. "No, no, no, please, no, please." She collapsed, her back hitting the rough plank wall, and she slid to the floor. She was scrambling, her feet kicking in the filth, trying to get away from it. Eli froze. He looked from her, a crumpled, sobbing heap of terror, to the rope. His face, in the lantern light, was a mask of sudden, terrible understanding. He didn't rush to her. He didn't say, "It's all right." He simply walked past her, his movements calm and deliberate. He set the lantern on the floor, far from her, so the light was there, but not on her. He drew his knife, with one swift, angry motion. He reached up and slashed the rope, cutting it from the beam. He didn't just let it fall. He grabbed it, balled it up, and hurled it into the darkest corner of the cabin. He said nothing. He went to the rusted stove and, with the efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times, he used his hatchet to break up the rotted table for kindling. He started a fire. The small stove popped and hissed, but it began to throw off a weak, blessed heat. He went about his business. He unrolled his pack. He made coffee. He opened a can of beans and set it in the embers to heat. Clara stayed huddled against the wall, her sobs slowly quieting into raw, gasping shudders. She watched him. He never looked at her. He was giving her the one thing no one else ever had, space. He was patient. He was a silent, steady presence in the storm, both outside and in. An hour passed. The blizzard shrieked, but inside, the fire was a low roar. The smell of coffee filled the small room, cutting through the rot. Eli poured coffee into 2 tin cups. He took one. He set the other on the floor. Halfway between them, he set a plate with hardtack and the hot beans next to it. He sat on his bedroll, his back to the wall, and drank his coffee. He waited. Finally, her voice came from the shadows, cracked and broken. "He sold me." Eli didn't move. He just listened. "My uncle, in Missouri, after my folks died from the fever, he said I was just another mouth to feed. He sold me to a man I'd never seen, for $50. Said it was a debt." She crawled, slowly, toward the fire, toward the heat. She pulled her blanket around her. She didn't touch the coffee. "His name was Subtle. He brought me to that outpost. He told them I was his. He told them he'd bought me, fair and square." She was talking to the fire, the words tumbling out, words she hadn't dared even think. "They tied me. At night, he had a rope. He'd tie me to the bedpost, like a dog, like an animal. He said it was so I wouldn't run, but it wasn't. It was so they'd all know." She was weeping again, silent tears that dripped onto her dirty hands. "So they'd all know I was a thing, that I was his property." She finally looked up at him, her face a ruin of bruises and tear tracks, her eyes hollow in the lantern light. "You've been kind to me," she whispered, the words sounding foreign. You fed me. You cleaned my hands. You gave me your horse. Why? Her voice hardened, a sliver of the old, wild fear. What do you want from me? You want to save me? The question hung in the tiny, warm cabin, heavy with all the pain of the world. Eli looked at her, and his own ghosts were there in his eyes. He saw the face of the young man on the gallows, the rope pulling taut. He saw the innocents he'd murdered. He saw her, another soul tied and bound. He set his cup down, his voice so low she barely heard it over the wind. No, Clara, he said, his gaze steady, holding hers. I want to heal you. She stared at him. She stared for a full minute, the only sound the fire and the wind. She saw no lie in his eyes, no pity, just a truth so raw it hurt to look at. She nodded, once, a small, jerky movement. She reached for the cup of coffee, her hands shaking, and drank. It was the first time she believed she might still be human. The storm trapped them for 2 days. They spoke little, but the silence was different. It was shared. On the 3rd morning, the world was white and still, the sky a painful, brilliant blue. They packed up and left the cabin. They were moving through a narrow pass, the snow thigh-deep. Eli leading the mare, Clara walking behind him, her feet much better. The silence of the new snow was absolute. Well, looky here. The voice, loud and cheerful, cracked the silence. Eli froze. He shoved Claire behind the mare. A man stepped out from behind a stand of pine, not 20 yards away. He was young, with a patchy beard and mean, close-set eyes. He held a rifle, and it was pointed right at Eli's chest. I've been tracking you for 2 days. Oh, man, the man sneered. Wasn't easy after that snow. Suttle's gonna be so pleased to get his property back. His eyes slid past Eli. To Clara. He's offered a reward, and I'll be pleased to take this horse and mule off your hands as a bonus. Clara's breath stopped. It was him. The one called Jed. The one who had laughed when Suttle tied her. Eli's voice was calm. Dead. Let her go. This is between me and you. I don't think so, Jed said, his smile widening. He raised the rifle. I think I'll just take it all. I wouldn't. He never finished. Eli's hand, which had been resting on his thigh, was a blur. The sound of the pistol shot was deafening, a sharp, flat crack that echoed off the mountains. Jed looked surprised. A red flower bloomed on his chest. He staggered, his rifle discharging into the snow at his feet. He looked down at the blood, then up at Eli, his mean eyes wide with disbelief. Then he toppled, face first, into the snowdrift. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before. Eli stood, his pistol still pointed, his body smoking in the cold air. He was breathing hard. He turned and looked at Clara. She was staring at the body. A man she had seen every day for 2 months. A man who had watched her suffer and done nothing. He was dead. Eli holstered his pistol and walked forward, nudging the body with his boot. He was dead. Eli walked back to Clara. He looked exhausted. He looked, she thought, like he was going to be sick. He was expecting her to scream. He was expecting her to run. She did neither. She just stood up from behind the horse. She looked at the dead man in the snow, a dark stain spreading around him. She looked at Eli, at the gun on his hip, at his shaking hand, and she fell to her knees. A wail tore out of her, a sound of such profound, agonizing release it didn't sound human. She wasn't crying for the dead man. She wasn't crying from fear. You, she gasped, her hands covering her face. You fought for me. You killed him. For me. She wept, not at the violence, but at the terrible, beautiful, shocking fact of the protection. No one had ever fought for her. No one had ever valued her. She was property, but this man, this ghost, had just killed for her. He stood over her, his hand twitching, wanting to comfort her, but not knowing how. He let her cry. That night, the camp was grim. They were miles away, hidden in a deep cleft of rock. Eli was silent, his mood black and heavy. The killing had brought his own ghosts back, and they were sitting with him by the fire. He built the fire. He gave her food. The routine was the same, but a chasm had opened between them. He was a killer. He had done it for her, and that knowledge was a heavy, terrifying thing. He sat on his bedroll, his back to her, staring into the flames. She watched him. He was lost. She knew the look. Later, the moon was a cold, silver dollar in the black sky. Eli was in his bedroll, a still, dark shape. She was in her blanket, the cold seeping in from the ground. But it wasn't the cold that made her tremble. It was the silence, the aloneness. She stood up. Her bare feet made no sound on the frozen ground. He was awake. His hand was on his knife hilt before she'd taken 2 steps. "Eli?" she whispered. His head turned. He saw her, pale and shaking in the moonlight. She came and knelt by his bedroll. She didn't try to get in. She just knelt, her hands clasped in front of her. "I'm cold," she whispered. And they both knew it was a lie. And they both knew it was the deepest truth. She reached out, her small, scarred hand hovering in the air, not daring to touch him. Her voice was a bare thread of sound. Can I feel safe with you?" His heart, which he'd thought was long since dead, felt like it was being squeezed in a fist. He saw her, not as a woman, but as a terrified, wounded child. He saw the trust she was offering, a trust he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. He didn't speak. He just lifted the edge of the heavy wool blanket. An invitation. She crawled in. She didn't lie beside him. She lay on top of his bedroll, on the other side of his body, still in her own clothes, still separate. She was a small, rigid, shaking line of ice. He didn't touch her. He just lay there, the two of them breathing in the dark. A sob, violent and sudden, broke from her. She tried to smother it, slowly, carefully. He moved. He didn't pull her close. He didn't try to kiss her. He just rolled onto his side and put his arm over her, a heavy, warm weight, a shield, an anchor. That was all it took. She turned, burying her face in the rough wool of his coat. And she wept. She cried for her lost parents, for her uncle's betrayal, for the stink of the outpost, for the bite of the rope. She cried for the man in the snow, and for the man who had put him there. Eli held on. He held her while she trembled, his face pressed into her hair, which smelled of smoke and pine. He held her, and his own eyes burned, the ghosts of the hanging and the man in the past swirling around them. They didn't make love. They didn't kiss. They just held each other. 2 broken, damaged souls, trembling in the vast, dark wilderness. And for the first time in years, for one night, neither of them was truly alone. The morning light was a cold, cruel gray. Clara awoke with a start, her body rigid. For one brief, terrifying second, she didn't know where she was. She was warm. That was the first alarm. She was warm, and she was not alone. She was in his bedroll. She had crawled in, and he had held her. Her eyes snapped open. He was asleep, or pretending to be, his back to her. His breathing was deep and even. She was tucked against the long, solid line of his spine, his arm still draped heavily over her waist, a shield, even in sleep. Panic, hot and acidic, rose in her throat. She had been a fool. She had been weak. She had traded one cage for another, letting her guard down for a moment of warmth. She slipped out, a snake shedding its skin, moving with a silent, practiced stealth. She grabbed her own blanket and scrambled to the far side of the cold campfire, her heart hammering. She pulled the wool up to her chin, her eyes fixed on him, waiting. Eli did not move for a long time. Then, he sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion, and sat up. He didn't look at her. He ran his hands through his hair, his back still to her, and she saw the tension in his shoulders. He was not a man who slept easy. He stood, stretched, and went about the morning's business, his movements stiff. He checked the horses, his hands moving over them with a quiet familiarity. He rebuilt the fire. He put the coffee pot in the embers. He was the killer, the man who had shot Jed, and he was the man who had held her while she cried. The two things could not exist in the same person. And yet, here he was. He poured her a cup of coffee and set it on a rock. Halfway between them, the old routine. But everything was new. Everything was strange and sharp at the edges. He picked up his rifle and walked away from the camp, moving up the ridge, his steps silent in the snow. Scouting. She drank the coffee, her hands shaking so hard the hot liquid slopped over the tin rim. It was bitter, and it was good. He was gone for almost an hour. Clara's panic had subsided, replaced by a new, cold dread. What if he didn't come back? What if he had decided she was too much trouble and had left her? The thought was a stone in her stomach. Then he was there, appearing between two pines as silently as he had left. His face was a mask, his eyes hard and empty. "Pack," he said. The word was a knife. "What is it?" "Just pack. We're moving. Now!" His urgency was a new, sharp fear. She did as he said, her clumsy, scarred hands fumbling with the bedroll. He didn't pack the supplies with his usual care. He shoved things into bags, his movements fast and angry. "What did you see?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Tracks," he said, not looking at her. He kicked snow over the fire, dousing it. "Jed's tracks, and the ones that followed him." "Followed him?" "3 riders. They fanned out back in the pass, where I lost them in the storm. They've been hunting you. Now they're hunting us." He grabbed the mare's bridle. "They're not just drifters, Clara. They're organized, and they know these mountains." She stood frozen, the half-rolled blanket in her hands. "It's me. They're here for me." "They're here for you," he bit out. "But they'll kill me to get to you. Let's ride." He threw her up onto the mare, not asking, and took the mule's lead. He didn't take the trail. He pushed them straight up the side of the mountain, through thick, pathless snow and scratching pine. They rode hard for hours, the air growing thinner, the silence broken only by the crunch of the animals' hooves and the whistle of the wind through the high rocks. They stopped at a frozen waterfall to let the horses breathe. Clara slid from the mare, her body aching. She looked at Eli. He was standing, his back to her, scanning the valley below. He was a statue, a man carved from the same gray rock he stood on. She walked to him, her feet numb in her ruined boots. "Eli." He didn't turn. "You have to leave me." That made him turn. His eyes were flint. "What did you say?" "Leave me," she said, the words a torrent, desperate and small. "At the next town. You said it was called Dustwood. Just take me to the edge of it. Give me some food, and you ride on." "You're a fool." "No," she insisted, her voice breaking. "You're the fool if you stay." "You killed one of them. They won't stop until they find you. It's me they want. If Subtle gets me back, he'll be angry, but he'll have what he wants. He'll let you go." "You believe that?" he asked, his voice soft and dangerous. "You think a man like that just lets things go?" "You'll die," she whispered, her hands clenching at her sides. "You'll die because of me. I'm just trouble. I'm just baggage. I've been baggage my whole life." He grabbed her. His hands shot out and gripped her by the shoulders, not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to hold her, to make her stop. His face was inches from hers, his gray eyes blazing with a sudden, terrible fire. "Don't you ever," he said, his voice a low, ragged growl. "Say that again." He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at the world that had made her believe it. "You are not baggage," he said, his grip tightening. He was shaking. "Clara." He stopped, the words caught in his throat. He looked away, up at the cold, empty sky, as if searching for them. When he looked back, the fire was gone, replaced by a raw, naked honesty that stripped her bare. "For 2 years," he said, his voice hoarse, "I've been a ghost. I've been just dust and wind. I haven't been alive. I've just been moving until that day at the creek. You." He shook his head, a small, pained movement. "You're the reason I still breathe." She stared at him, her mouth open, the words he'd spoken echoing in the vast, cold silence of the mountain. He wasn't talking about love. He was talking about purpose. He wasn't saving her. She was saving him. He let her go, his hands dropping to his sides as if they were heavy. He turned his back on her again. "We're not going to Dustwood," he said, his voice flat, the moment over. "Not yet. We're taking the high trail. It's dangerous, but they won't expect it." She didn't speak. She just went to the mare and pulled herself into the saddle. She watched the back of his head as he led them on. The man who breathed because of her, and she, who had been held by him, felt the first tiny, terrifying spark of what it meant to live. The high trail was a scar on the face of the mountain. It was a path meant for goats, a narrow ledge of shale and ice that hung over a drop of 1,000 feet. The wind up here didn't just blow. It tried to peel them from the rock. They moved at a crawl. Eli was walking, leading the mare, his boots slipping on the icy stone. The food ran low. The small sack of beans was empty. The hardtack was down to crumbs. They had coffee, but no fire to make it with. The wind was too high, the risk of a spark too great. They were cold, they were hungry, and they were high above the world. On the third day on the ridge, Clara began to fail. It started with a shiver she couldn't stop. Her hands, in Eli's spare gloves, were numb. Her feet were 2 blocks of ice. She had stopped talking, her energy focused on just holding the saddle horn. "We have to stop," Eli said, his voice chapped and raw. "There's a line cabin, a trapper's place. It's just over this ridge." He was lying, but he needed to give her hope. She just nodded, her head bobbing, her eyes half closed. She stumbled when he helped her down. He caught her, and his hand brushed her forehead. It was on fire. "Damn it," he breathed. "Damn it all." Her foot, the one she'd cut, the cold and the damp and the exhaustion, it had all come back. The wound had festered, poisoning her from the ground up. Just a little tired," she mumbled. Her words slurred. "So cold, Eli, I'm so cold." She collapsed. Not a faint, but a simple folding of her legs, her body giving up. Eli's heart stopped. "Clara!" He hauled her up. She was a dead weight, her head lolling. The snow, which had been a gentle fall, was beginning to thicken. A real storm was coming in. He looked at the horses. He looked at Clara. He made his choice. He tore the supplies from the mule, leaving the flour, the salt, everything but the blankets and his knife. He slapped the mule's rump, sending it scrambling down a side path. "Go!" He threw the pack on the mare, then lifted Clara. He tried to put her on the saddle, but she couldn't hold on. She slid off, a boneless, fever-racked doll. He was going to have to carry her. He wrapped her in 2 of the wool blankets, a tight cocoon, and hoisted her into his arms. She weighed nothing. She was just bones and fever. "Hold on, Clara," he whispered, his face pressed to her hair. "You just hold on." He left the mare. He couldn't lead the horse and carry her on this path. He just walked. He walked for hours. The snow became a white, blinding curtain. The wind was a physical force, a giant's hand trying to push him from the ledge. His legs were burning. His arms were numb. But he didn't let her go. He just put one foot in front of the other. He was guided by a memory, a story from another trapper, 2 winters ago, a cabin, an emergency shelter. He had to find it. He was dying. He knew it. His lungs were on fire. He was freezing, but he could not stop. He was carrying his own breath. He stumbled, his knee hitting a rock, and he went down, curling his body around her. Taking the impact himself, he lay in the snow, the world a white, howling void, her small, hot body in his arms. "I'm sorry, Clara," he gasped, his breath frosting. I'm so sorry." He looked up, and he saw it. Not 10 yards away, a dark shape, a smudge against the white, the angle of a roof, the cabin. He got to his feet. He didn't know how. He used his last ounce of strength, his last shred of will, and he kicked the door open, falling inside with her. It was a tiny, 1-room hovel, dark, cold, but out of the wind. He spilled her, gently, onto the floor, and he tore the room apart. There was wood, a small stack of dry pine in a box. A miracle. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely strike the match. It caught. He built the fire, his movements frantic. A small, beautiful flame licked the kindling, and then the wood caught. Heat. He barred the door, shutting out the howl, and turned to her. She was unconscious, her breathing a shallow, ragged rasp. He worked. He stripped her wet clothes off, his hands ruthlessly efficient, and wrapped her in the last dry blanket. He propped her up near the fire. He boiled snow in his tin cup and cleaned her foot. It was bad, black and red, swollen and angry. He did what he could. He lanced the wound, he cleaned it, he bound it, and then he waited. The storm raged for 2 days. He did not sleep. He sat by her, feeding the fire, forcing sips of hot, sweet water. He had sugar in his pack between her cracked lips. She was delirious. She cried out, not for him, but for her mother. She begged Subtle to stop, to take the rope off. She argued with her uncle, her voice a child's, small and betrayed. Eli sat and listened. He held her hand when she thrashed. And in the long, dark hours, with the wind screaming like a banshee, he talked. He didn't know if she could hear him. He didn't care. He was talking to her ghost, or his own. "Don't you leave me," he whispered, his voice cracking, his face buried in her hot, dry hand. You think I'm some kind of hero, some good man. I'm not. Clara, I'm not." He wiped his eyes on his sleeve. "I hunted men," he confessed to the sleeping girl. "For money. I was a bounty hunter. Good at it, too." His voice was bitter. "There was this kid in Texas, down near the border. Just a boy, 19, maybe. William. He looked guilty. Everyone said so. He'd been running. I brought him in." He stopped, the memory choking him. I put the rope on him. "Clara, I stood on the platform. I watched him hang. I took my money. He was rocking, his body shaking with the force of the confession. I found out 2 days later. He was innocent. He'd just stolen his ma's savings. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't a bank robber. He was just a stupid kid. And I murdered him. For money." He was weeping. The first tears he'd shed in years. Hot and burning. "That's who I am. Clara, that's the man who's trying to heal you. A fraud. A killer. That's why I run. I got his ghost. He rides with me. Every day." He laid his head on the cot beside her. Exhausted. Empty. "So you gotta live. You gotta be my penance." He must have slept. He awoke to a touch, a hand, weak and trembling, in his hair. He jerked awake. Clara was looking at him. Her fever was broken. Her eyes were clear, dark pools in her pale, gaunt face. The cabin was quiet. The storm had passed. "Eli," she whispered. Her voice was a dry scrape. He was ashamed. He'd been caught. He tried to pull away, to stand, to be the protector. You're awake. How do you feel? You need water." "I heard you," she whispered, her hand still on his head. About the boy. William." He froze, his face a mask of shame. He couldn't look at her. Subtle, all of them," she said, her voice so soft he had to lean in. "They touched me like I was a thing, a piece of ruined property, just meat." She closed her eyes, a tear tracking from the corner. "I thought I was ruined. I thought I'd never be clean. I'd never want a man's hand on me again." She opened her eyes, and her gaze was so clear, so strong. It pinned him. "But you," she said, You're not like them. You're broken. You see me. You don't see a ruined thing. You see yourself." She lifted her weak hand and touched his cheek, his rough beard. "I want to be touched." "Eli," she whispered, the words a prayer, "but only by you. I want to be touched by someone who knows what it is to be ruined, by someone who knows how to heal." He looked at her, his heart a stone, a fire, a flood. He saw her. this girl who had been through the depths of hell, offering him absolution. He leaned in, his movements slow, agonizing. He was asking permission with his eyes, with his breath. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She just watched him, her gaze unwavering. He touched his lips to her forehead, a brand of reverence. He kissed her eyelids, salty with tears. And then he kissed her mouth. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was slow, and it was gentle, and it was a promise. It was two broken halves, finding a way to be whole. That night, the cabin was still. The storm was gone, leaving a world of white, silent stars. The lantern on the table cast a low, golden light. He had fed her, broth from a grouse he'd snared. She was stronger. The color was back in her cheeks. They sat in silence for a long time. He on the floor by the fire. She in the bedroll. She held out her hand. He went to her. He sat on the edge of the cot. He was trembling. He was terrified, not of her, but of himself, of the ghost of William, of the shadows of Subtle. "Clara," he began, his voice rough. I don't want to be like them. I don't want to take—" "You won't," she said, her voice sure. "You're the man who cut the rope." She took his hand and placed it on her scarred wrist. He didn't pull away. He unfastened the clean binding he had put there. He raised her wrist to his lips and kissed the new, pink, puckered skin. He moved slowly, with a worship he didn't know he possessed. He was not a man driven by hunger. He was a man driven by a desperate need to mend. He touched her bruises, her scars, her hair, as if she were made of spun glass. He was not taking, he was giving. He was giving her back her own body. And as he finally came to her, as they finally became one, a sound tore from her. It was a sob, and it was a laugh, a sound of such profound, painful, beautiful release that it broke his heart and healed it all at once. She was crying out all the pain, all the shame, all the filth, and he was holding her, whispering her name, over and over, like a prayer. He was holding her, and she was healing him. Outside, the world was calm. The moon shone on the fresh, clean snow. Miles back, down the pass, a man on horseback, his face hidden by a thick beard and a low-brimmed hat, dismounted. He knelt in the snow, his gloved hand brushing the drift from a track. The track was old, from before the storm, but it was there, a man's boot, a horse, heading up toward the high, dangerous trail. The man, Harlan, looked up. He smiled, a slow, ugly movement of his lips. He knew that trail. He knew the trapper's cabin. He pulled himself back into the saddle and urged his horse on. The world was white and still, a clean, silent page waiting for a story. They had left the trapper's cabin 2 days after the storm, their bodies healed, their spirits bound by a new, fragile intimacy. Eli had found his mare grazing in a sheltered valley, a small miracle that felt like a pardon. The mule was gone, but the mare was all that mattered. They rode double, Clara in front, her back pressed against Eli's chest. The position, which once would have sent her into a blind panic, now felt like the only solid thing in the world. His arms were around her, his hands on the reins, and his breath was warm on her hair. He had not spoken of his confession again, and she had not asked. It lay between them, a shared ghost, but it was no longer his alone. They descended from the high passes, leaving the snow and ice behind. The air grew warmer, the ground turning from rock to frozen mud, and finally, to the sparse, brown grass of the lowlands. Dustwood appeared in the late afternoon of the 4th day. It was not a settlement, it was a scar, tucked into a muddy valley. It was a raw collection of perhaps 30 buildings, most of them unpainted pine, leaning at weary angles. A single, wide street, more of a trough than a road, ran through its center, populated by sullen-looking men and a few worn-down women. The air smelled of wet wood, sour whiskey, and manure. Eli stopped the mare at the edge of town, his body going tense. "Stay here," he murmured, his voice low. "No," she said, her own voice just as quiet. "We're in this together." He didn't argue. He just nodded, his jaw tight, and nudged the mare forward. They drew eyes. A man hauling a crippled horse was a common sight, but a man hauling a woman who looked like Clara was a spectacle. Her face was still mapped with the last, fading yellow of her bruises. Her hair was a wild tangle, cut short and unevenly by Eli's knife back at the cabin. She wore his spare shirt, which was 3 sizes too large, and a pair of his trousers, belted with a piece of rope. They looked like what they were, 2 desperate people who had run out of wilderness. Eli dismounted in front of the largest building, which had a sagging sign that read General Mercantile Post. He helped her down, his hands careful on her waist. "Wait by the horse. Don't talk to anyone." He went inside. Clara stood, her hand on the mare's flank, trying to make herself small. She watched the street. Men stared. They didn't just look, they stared, their eyes lingering, assessing. She felt the old, cold shame rising in her, the feeling of being a piece of meat on a hook. She wrapped her arms around herself, her back to the wall. Eli was inside for a long time. Too long. When he came out, his face was pale, his eyes like 2 chips of slate. He didn't look at her. He walked to the mare and began checking the cinch, his movements jerky and angry. "Eli?" she whispered. "We need to go," he said, his voice flat. "What is it? What happened?" He finally looked at her, and his gaze was so full of despair. She felt her stomach drop. "He's been here, subtle." Her blood went cold. "Subtle? Here?" "Not just here. He was here a week ago, right after Jed went missing. He came here looking for his property." Eli spat the word like it was poison. "He talked to the law. He filed a claim." "A claim?" "He told them he had a runaway servant girl, bound by a contract her family signed, said she was simple-minded, prone to fits." Eli's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "And that she'd been stolen." "Stolen?" "By a drifter. A man wanted for murder?" Clara's breath caught. "No, he means you? He's accusing you of killing Jed?" "Worse," Eli said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's not talking about Jed. He's talking about a bounty hunter who hung an innocent boy in Texas 2 years ago." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "But how? How could he know that?" "He must have recognized me. Or my name. It doesn't matter. He told the sheriff, his name is Mallory, that I was a known killer, a fugitive, that I'd stolen his horse, his mule, and his girl." "So," she whispered, the trap closing around them. "Subtle owns the law here. He owns the town." Eli grabbed the reins. "We have to leave, now. We can't fight this, not here." "Where do we go? Eli, we're out of mountains." "I don't know. South. We just have to. That'll be far enough. Friend." The voice was large and oily. A man stepped out of the shadow of the mercantile, blocking their path. He was a big man, his belly straining a stained wool vest. A silver star was pinned to it. But it was dull, as if it, too, were corrupt. He was chewing on a piece of straw, his eyes small and shrewd. "Sheriff Mallory," he said. It wasn't an introduction. It was a statement of fact. "I've been waiting for you. Heard Suttle's property finally turned up." His eyes raked over Clara, a slow, insulting appraisal that made her skin crawl. "Don't look like much, but Suttle wants her back, all the same. And he wants the man who stole her." "She's not property," Eli said, his voice a low, deadly rumble. He stepped in front of Clara, shielding her. "And I didn't steal her." "That's not what the paper says," Mallory said, his smile widening. He patted a folded piece of paper in his vest pocket. "Got a legal contract. Says he bought her, fair and square. And I've got a telegraph from Texas. Says a man named Eli Stone is wanted for questioning in the wrongful death of one William Parker." Eli's face went white. His name, the one thing he'd tried to bury. "So," Mallory continued, his hand drifting to the pistol on his hip, "it seems to me you're a murderer and a thief. And you," he sneered at Clara, "are a runaway in Dustwood. We take a dim view of both. You're both under arrest." "No," Clara said, her voice shaking but hard. "You can't. He didn't do anything. Be quiet, girl, before I have you gagged." Mallory drew his gun. His easy manner gone. "Now, Eli Stone, you're gonna unbuckle that belt, real slow, or I'll put a bullet in you right here and tell Subtle his girl was killed resisting arrest." Eli didn't move. His hand was hovering over his own gun. Clara could feel the tension in him, the desperate, coiled energy. He was calculating. He was thinking of fighting. He would die. Mallory was waiting for it. "Eli, don't," she whispered, her hand grabbing his sleeve. He looked at her, his face a mask of agony. He was trapped. His past and his present had collided, and she was caught in the middle. He let out a long, slow breath. His shoulders sagged. He looked back at Mallory. "Let her go," he said, his voice raw. Mallory laughed. "I don't think I'm in a bargaining mood. Let her go," Eli repeated, his voice harder. She's simple. Like he said, she didn't know what she was doing." "I forced her. I took her. It was all me." Clara's heart broke. He was using Subtle's own lie. He was trying to save her by painting her as the fool Subtle claimed she was. "Eli, no!" "It was me," Eli said. His eyes locked on the sheriff. Ignoring her. "You want the murderer. You want the thief. Here I am. You'll get your bounty. Just let her go. Give her to one of the women in town. Let her work in the saloon. I don't care. Just don't give her back to him." He was offering his life. He was offering to hang for a crime he'd already paid for in guilt, just to keep her from Subtle. Mallory considered it, tapping his chin with the barrel of his gun. "Well now, that's noble. But you see, Subtle was real clear. He wants the man, and he wants his property. He's paying me for both. So, I'm afraid it's the jail for the two of you." He motioned with the gun. "Now, the belt, or the girl gets it first." Clara looked at Eli. He was defeated. The fight was gone. His eyes were dead. Slowly, his hands went to his buckle. I need a moment," Clara said, her voice high and panicked. "Please, I'm unwell. The ride." Mallory scowled. "What?" I'm going to be sick," she gasped, clutching her stomach. Behind the building." She didn't wait for an answer. She stumbled away, half falling, toward the dark, narrow alley between the mercantile and the saloon. "Don't you run, girl," Mallory yelled. "She's not running," Eli said, his voice loud, drawing the sheriff's attention back. "She's just sick. Give her a minute. You can see me. I'm not going anywhere." Mallory grunted, keeping his gun on Eli. But he was annoyed. The delay, the woman's weakness, it bothered him. Clara scrambled into the alley. It stank of piss and rotten food. She leaned against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would break her ribs. She wasn't sick. She was thinking. He had offered his life for her. She heard a sound, a soft scrape, from the other end of the alley. From the shadows near the livery, a figure stepped out, a man. He was old, his skin dark, his hair a shock of white wool. He was carrying a harness. He put a finger to his lips. He looked at her, his eyes kind and old and seeing everything. He'd seen her face, her clothes. His gaze flickered to her wrists, which were bare, the new, pink scars plain in the dim light. His face, which had been kind, hardened. "You Subtle's girl," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "He's a bad man," the stableman said, his eyes on the street, on Mallory's broad back. "And that sheriff, he's worse. He's poison. I seen what he does. I seen what he did to others." He looked back at her. "You and your man. You're not getting out of that jail. Not alive." "What can we do?" she whispered, the tears finally coming. "You can run," he said. "The sun will be down in 10 minutes. It'll be dark. I'll make a sound. At the back of the saloon. It'll draw him. When he moves, you and your man, you run. You run for the livery. And then, there's 2 horses, saddled. In the last 2 stalls. They're for a poker game tonight. You take 'em. You ride south, you ride fast, and you don't stop. They're fast horses. Faster than anything Mallory's got. He'll hurt you, she said. The old man, Josiah, just looked at her, and his eyes were tired. I'm 73 years old. Child. I'm too old to be scared, and I'm too old to watch this happen again. Now, be ready. He slipped back into the shadows. Clara took a deep breath. She was shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was from a cold, sharp resolve. She wiped her face on her sleeve and walked back out onto the street. Mallory scowled. About time. Now, Stone, the crash. A sound like a wagon load of tin pans hit the ground, followed by a horse's terrified squeal and a man shouting. It came from behind the saloon. What in the... Mallory's head snapped around. Stay put, both of you, he snarled, and he ran toward the sound, his gun still in his hand. Now, Eli, Clara screamed. She grabbed his hand. He didn't hesitate. He was a man coming back to life. He snatched his gun belt as they ran, buckling it as he moved. And they sprinted, low and fast, across the street toward the dark mouth of the livery. Hey, a man shouted from the saloon doorway. They're running. A shot cracked, the bullet whining past Eli's ear. They dove into the livery. It was dark, the smell of hay and horses a sudden comfort. Last 2 stalls, Clara gasped. They found them. 2 sleek geldings, already saddled. Eli checked the cinches in the dark, his hands moving with blind, expert speed. Josiah was there, in the shadows. Go, child, he said, pressing a canvas sack into her hands. Food and water. Godspeed. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick. Don't thank me, he said. Just live. Eli threw her onto one horse and mounted the other. Shouts were coming from the street. A lantern flared. This way, Eli said, and he spurred the horse, not toward the street, but toward the back. He kicked open the wide back doors of the livery, and they burst out into the night, the horses' hooves thundering on the hard-packed earth. They rode for hours, the moon just a sliver, a half-moon that gave just enough light to see. They didn't follow a road. They plunged into the low, rolling hills, the horses powerful beneath them, eating up the ground. They didn't stop until the moon was high, and the lights of Dustwood and the sound of pursuit were long gone. They found a dry gully, a deep cut in the earth hidden by a stand of juniper. They watered the horses at a small seep, their breathing ragged, their bodies soaked in sweat. Eli slid from the saddle, his legs shaking. Clara did the same. They stood, just looking at each other in the pale moonlight. They were alive. They were free. You saved us, Eli said, his voice rough. Back there, you were quick. You saw him. We saved each other, she said. He stepped toward her, and his hands came up to cup her face. He was trembling. Clara, what I said, back there, about you being simple. I know, she whispered, covering his hands with her own. I know. You were trying to save me. He knew my name. He knew about William. The words were a choked confession. I'm a dead man. Clara, they'll hunt me now. Not just subtle. The law, they'll have posters. I've dragged you into this. I've ruined you all over again. He was crumbling. The man who had been a rock, her shield, was broken by his own past. He was the one haunted now, not just by William, but by the fact that his ghost had almost cost her everything. She looked at him, at this strong, broken man who saw himself as a murderer, and she, who had been a victim, felt a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed. She was the one who was whole. He was the one who was in pieces. No, she said, her voice clear and strong in the night air. You're wrong. You didn't drag me anywhere. I followed. You didn't ruin me. You healed me. She pulled his head down, her fingers in his hair. You need to trust. Eli, you're not that man. You're not the man who hung that boy. You're the man who cut the rope. You're the man who carried me through a storm. She held him, her small body anchoring him as he shook. You need to trust me, she whispered. I'm not that broken girl from the creek. Not anymore. They stood there for a long time, the silence of the hills wrapping around them. I have a dream, she said, her voice soft, her face pressed against his chest. A dream? I want to raise horses. She laughed, a small, wet sound. It's stupid, I know, but I love them. They're strong, they're free. But people break them. They rope them, and they put steel in their mouths, and they break them. I want to find a place, a small place, and I want to raise horses. But I want to do it, gentle, no ropes, no breaking. I want them to trust. He pulled back, just enough to see her face in the moonlight. That's not stupid. Clara, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. And I want to do it. Alone, she said, her gaze fierce. I mean, I want to belong to myself. I don't ever want to be property again. Not Subtle's, not anyone's. He understood. He nodded, his heart aching with a love so fierce it hurt. I know. The air between them was electric. It was no longer the soft, healing tenderness of the cabin. This was something else. This was raw. It was desperate. They had escaped, but they were not safe. Subtle was out there. Mallory was out there. The ghosts were out there. They had this night, this gully, this moment, and it might be all they ever had. The realization hung between them, heavy and sharp. Eli, she said, her voice low, her hand sliding from his face down his chest. His breath hitched. I'm not that girl from the cabin, either, she said, her eyes dark, her fear gone, replaced by a deep, urgent need. I'm not glass. I'm not a wound. I'm alive. She grabbed the front of his shirt. I need to feel it. I need to feel you. I don't want to be pitied. Her voice broke, just for a second. Don't be gentle, please. I don't want to be healed tonight. I want to be wanted. She was reclaiming herself. She was not just asking for him. She was demanding her own right to feel, to want, to take. He looked at her, and he saw not the victim, but the survivor. He saw the woman who had saved him in the street. He saw the fire in her. His answer was not a word. He kissed her. It was not the reverent, gentle kiss from the cabin. It was a kiss of desperation, of hunger, of two people clinging to each other on the edge of a cliff. It was rough, and it was urgent, and it was exactly what she had asked for. He laid her down on the saddle blankets, the half-moon painting them in silver and shadow. He was not gentle. He was as desperate, as hungry as she was. He touched her with a fire that was meant to burn away the last of the ghosts, to burn away Subtle and the ropes and the shame. But even in his roughness, there was care. Even in his urgency, there was a worship. He was not taking, he was answering. He was meeting her, matching her, giving her the fire she demanded. It was a turning point. It was not healing. It was a claiming. It was her, finally, claiming her own body, her own life. In the first light of dawn, the air was cold and sharp. They lay tangled in the blankets, her head on his chest, his arm heavy around her. They were exhausted, but they were alive. Clara sat up, pulling the blanket around her. Eli watched her. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small block of pine and his knife. He sat, his back against a rock, and he began to carve. His hands, which could be so gentle and so rough, were now focused, the blade peeling away slivers of wood with a practiced, steady rhythm. She watched him. She watched the shape emerge. It was a horse, a small, simple wooden horse, its head held high, its mane a sharp ridge. It was a horse in mid-stride, running, free. He worked for almost an hour, in silence. Finally, he blew the last of the shavings away and held it out to her. She took it. It was smooth and warm in her palm. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It's your dream, he said. his voice quiet. She clutched it, her eyes filling with tears. She looked at him, this man who had given her back her life. Then she held out her hand. "Your knife." He gave it to her, no questions asked. She turned the small horse over, and on its smooth belly, with careful, deliberate strokes, she began to carve. She carved her name, C-L-A-R-A. When she was finished, she handed the knife back to him. She looked at the horse, her name carved into the wood. It was a brand, but this one she had put there herself. She was not property. She was not baggage. She was not a runaway. She was Clara. She looked at Eli, the sun rising behind him, and she smiled. She was no longer just surviving. She was starting to live. They had lived in the gully for 3 days, a pocket of stolen time. On the third morning, Eli watched Clara as she fed the horses, her small hand stroking the gelding's nose, the wooden horse he had carved for her tucked into the waistband of her trousers. She was humming, a low, tuneless sound that was more precious to him than any music. She was living, she was breathing, but he was not. He was still a ghost, still running. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held her, the hands that had taken William Parker's life. He had told her that she was the reason he still breathed, but it had been a half-truth. She was the reason he wanted to breathe, but his past was still choking the air from his lungs. Subtle was out there. Mallory was back there, and his own name, Eli Stone, was a curse that would follow them both, a shadow that would eventually cover her light. They could ride south for 1,000 miles, but they would never be free. His ghost would always be riding just behind them, and Subtle's pursuit would always be just ahead. Running was not healing. It was just a slower way to bleed out. He had spent 2 years running from the man he was. But this woman, this slip of a thing who had survived the ropes and the cold and the fear, had shown him what it meant to stand. He could not, he would not, let her life be a mirror of his. He would not let her be defined by the men who had hurt her, or by the man who was now running beside her. Justice. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He had perverted it once. Now, he would serve it. "Clara," he said, his voice flat in the cool morning air. She turned, her small smile fading when she saw his face. "What is it? Did you hear something?" "We're not riding south," he said. She went still. "What do you mean?" "We're going back." The color drained from her face. "Back? Back to Dustwood?" "Eli, no, they'll kill us. Mallory, he—" "I know what he is," Eli said, walking toward her. He took her hands. They were small and rough, but they were not trembling. "We can run, Clara, we can run until our horses die, and then we can get new horses and run again, but Subtle will not stop. He's a man who cannot stand to lose his property. And Mallory, he'll send that telegraph. My name will be on every marshal's desk from here to the Capitol. There will be no place for us, no place for your horses, no place for this." He touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the faint yellow shadow of the last bruise. "I cannot," he said, his voice thick. "Let my past destroy your future. I will not. I owe a debt, not just to you, to a boy named William. I can't bring him back, but I can keep them from taking you." "How?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a terror that was warring with the new strength he saw in her. "How? Eli, they have the law. They have the guns." "The law," he said, a grim set to his jaw. "That's what we'll use. Mallory's not the only law. There are circuit judges, hard men, but some of them are fair. I worked with one years ago. A man named Silas Breen. He doesn't bend, and he hates corrupt town sheriffs. If I can get word to him, if I can get him to come to Dustwood, if you can tell him your story, he'll believe me, a woman, over a sheriff and a man with a contract? He'll believe me," Eli said, his voice quiet. "He knew me before. He'll listen, and when he sees you, when he hears you, he'll know the truth." She searched his face, her gaze desperate. She was looking for any sign of doubt, any hesitation. She found none. He was calm, his resolve as solid and cold as the mountain rock. He had made his decision. "They'll try to kill us before he ever gets there," she said. It wasn't a protest. It was a fact. "Yes," he said. "They will." She held his gaze. She had carved her own name. She had taken back her own body. This was the last step. She was not just a survivor. She had to be a witness. She nodded. Once. "All right," she said. "What do we do?" They didn't ride far. They used the stolen money in Josiah's sack to buy a few provisions at a tiny, isolated trading post run by an old Ute woman. They traded one of the fine geldings, a painful loss, for a pack mule, a sack of flour, and 2 sets of trail-worn men's clothes. That night, camped in a rocky canyon, the real work began. Clara took his knife. "It's too uneven," she said, grabbing a hank of her own hair. It's a mess. Do it right." He couldn't. His hand, so steady with a gun, shook at the thought of cutting her. She saw it. "Then I will—" She sawed at her hair, the dark locks falling onto the dusty blanket. She worked with a grim, tearless focus, cutting it short, close to her scalp, until she looked like a boy. A waif. The fine bones of her face stood out, sharp and defined. Her eyes looked huge. When she was done, she didn't look at him. She just said, "The binding." He gave her a long strip of clean cloth. She turned her back to him, pulling off his shirt. He saw the map of her scars in the moonlight, and his heart clenched. He heard her sharp intakes of breath as she bound her chest, pulling the cloth tight, flattening herself, erasing the woman and leaving the boy. She put on the new clothes, a grubby flannel shirt, canvas trousers held up by a rope, a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. "Clara," he whispered, his voice rough. She turned. "Clara's not here," she said, her voice a low, hard thing he didn't recognize. "Clara's gone. My name is Clem." They traveled by night, hiding by day, circling back toward Dustwood like 2 wolves. They arrived in the dead of night, 2 shadows on a mule, and went straight to the livery. Josiah was sleeping in a stall, his bed a pile of old blankets. Eli touched his shoulder, and the old man was awake in an instant, a knife in his hand. "Hush, old friend," Eli murmured. "It's us, Eli Stone." Josiah squinted in the dark. Then his eyes went wide. "Lord God Almighty, I thought you was halfway to Mexico. You're mad, both of you. Mallory's put a price on your head, $500, dead or alive." "That's why we're here," Eli said. He looked at Clara, who stood in the shadows, her hat pulled low. "This is Clem, my partner." Josiah looked, his gaze sharp, and he saw the small hands, the defiant tilt of the chin. He just nodded, his face grim. "What do you need? You can't stay here. They search this place twice a day." "I need you to send a telegraph," Eli said, "to Judge Silas Breen. He's in the next county, in Junction City. He's due there today." "Breen?" Josiah's eyebrows shot up. "You're calling in the Hawk." "He's the only one who can stop the foxes," Eli said. He scribbled a note on a piece of paper from his pack. "Judge, am in Dustwood. Have witness in the matter of William P. Need you. Am being hunted by the law. You said to call. I'm calling. E. Stone." Josiah read it. "He'll come. If he gets this, he'll come. He's a storm, that one, but it'll take him 2 days, 3, if the roads are bad." "Can you hide us for that long?" Clara's voice, her Clem voice, was a passable imitation of a young man's rasp. Josiah looked at her, then at Eli. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Not here. They'll find you. There's the church. It's empty. Built it 2 years ago, but the preacher ran off. No one goes there except for dust. It's at the end of town. Stone walls, a good cellar. You can hide there. I'll bring you food and water after dark." The wait was a living hell. The church was cold, the air inside stale and smelling of dead mice and disuse. They hid in the small, dark cellar, a dirt-floored hole under the pulpit. Listening, they heard the town, They heard horses. They heard Mallory shouting, his voice full of rage, questioning a freighter. They were prisoners, buried in the heart of the enemy's camp. Clara was a rock. She did not cry. She did not complain. She sat in the dark, her rifle across her knees, and she waited. You're strong," Eli whispered to her on the second night, the waiting stretching his nerves thin. "No," she whispered back, her voice just a breath in the dark. "I'm not. I'm just empty. I'm a gun. I'm waiting to be fired. And then it will be over, one way or another." On the third morning, the shouting was closer. Josiah hadn't come. He'd missed his delivery of food the night before. "Something's wrong," Eli said, his hand on his pistol. He crept up the stairs, peering through a crack in the cellar door. The church's main doors were open, spilling bright, terrifying sunlight onto the dusty floor. Two men stood in the aisle, their backs to him. One was Sheriff Mallory. The other was a tall, bearded man Eli didn't recognize. "I tell you, I tracked 'em this far," the bearded man said, his voice a low growl. "My horse picked up their trail coming out of the hills. They came back. It was Harlan." "And you lost them? Here?" Mallory spat. "I've turned this town upside down. That old man at the livery, he's not talking, but I know he's hiding them. I'll burn that place to the ground tonight, and him with it. Maybe they ain't in the town," Harlan said, his eyes scanning the empty pews. "Maybe they're in a place no one would look. Like a church." Mallory's head turned slowly. He looked at the pulpit. He looked at the cellar door. Eli's blood ran cold. He slipped back down the steps. "They're here. They know. Get your rifle." "Eli," Clara whispered, her face pale but calm. "We fight," he said. "We hold them. The judge. He has to be close." "Eli, listen!" Footsteps. Right above them. On the pulpit. The cellar door was torn open. Light flooded in, blinding them. Harlan stood there, a silhouette, his pistol pointed down. Well, he sneered. "Look what the rats dragged in. Suttle's gonna be—" Eli fired. He didn't aim. He just pointed and pulled the trigger, the sound a deafening explosion in the small space. Harlan roared, not in pain, but in rage, firing back into the darkness. The bullet splintered the wood by Eli's head. "Get up!" Eli shoved Clara toward the stairs. "Get out of the cellar! Go!" They scrambled up, Eli firing again to cover their retreat. They burst into the church's main room just as Mallory, who had been at the front door, ran in. "There they are! Kill them!" Eli shoved Clara behind the solid stone altar. "Stay down!" A bullet chipped the stone above her head. The standoff had begun. The church was a death trap. They were pinned. Eli was at one side of the altar, Clara at the other. Mallory and Harlan were using the pews as cover. And there were two more men at the front door. "Give up, stone!" Mallory yelled, his voice echoing in the holy space. "You're boxed. Give me the girl, and I'll make your death quick. Go to hell." Eli fired back, the shot splintering the pew Mallory was hiding behind. "Eli," Clara said, her voice impossibly calm. "There's a side door, by the vesting room. One of them, he's trying to get around." Eli glanced. She was right. He was pinned. He couldn't move. "He's mine," Clara said. "Clara, no!" She didn't listen. She crawled, low and fast, behind the line of pews, flanking the altar. She got to the small room, her rifle ready. The door burst open. It was not one of Mallory's deputies. It was one of Suttle's men, a young, pimply man she remembered, the one who had held her down while Suttle. He saw her. His eyes went wide. He'd been expecting Eli. "You," he gasped. The boy." Then he recognized her. His face split into a leering, ugly grin. "Well, hell, I get the reward and the prize. Suttle's gonna pay me extra for bringing you in warm." He raised his pistol. Clara looked at him. She saw his mean little eyes. She saw his wet lips. She saw the dirty hand on the gun. She thought of the ropes. She thought of the cold. She thought of the pain. She thought of the wooden horse. She did not feel rage. She did not feel fear. She felt a great, cold calm, a certainty. She pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening. The man was thrown back against the wall, his eyes wide with a final, stupid surprise. He slid to the floor, leaving a dark smear. Clara lowered the rifle. She was breathing. Her hands were steady. She had not been a victim. She had been a judge. "Clara!" Eli roared, his voice full of panic. "I'm all right," she called out, her voice clear. The shot had stunned the attackers, but it had also made them furious. "They're split!" Mallory bellowed. "Rush them! Kill them both!" Harlan and Mallory rose from the pews, both firing, a hail of lead that tore into the altar. Eli returned fire, but they were coming. Clara stepped out from the side room, raising her rifle to fire at Harlan. "No!" Harlan saw her, his face a mask of rage. He changed targets, his pistol swinging from Eli to her. "Clara, down!" Eli yelled. He did the only thing he could. He left his cover, his own body a shield, diving toward her, his pistol firing at Harlan. He hit Harlan. The big man staggered, a red flower blooming on his chest. But Harlan fired. Two. Eli felt it. A white-hot poker. A giant's fist, slamming into his left shoulder. It spun him around, his gun flying from his numb hand. He hit the floor, the world graying at the edges. "Eli!" Clara's scream was the last thing he heard. "Cease fire! Cease fire in the name of the law!" The voice was not Mallory's. It was a great, booming sound that cut through the gunfire like a cannon. Clara, kneeling over Eli, looked up. The front doors of the church were wide open. Framed in the sunlight stood a tall, broad man in a black coat, his face like a thunderhead, a star pinned to his lapel. Beside him, two federal marshals held rifles, leveled at Mallory. "Judge Breen?" Mallory stammered, his pistol lowering. I was apprehending a known murderer and his accomplice." "You were," Breen said, his voice like grinding stones. "Committing murder in a house of God. Silas," he said to one marshal. "Disarm that, sheriff." "Put him in irons." "Your Honor, you can't. I'm the law here." "You are the law," Breen said, striding down the aisle. The entire town, drawn by the gunfight, was crowding in behind him. "Your authority is hereby suspended. As of this moment, this is my courtroom." He stopped, his gaze falling on the scene. Harlan and the other man, dead. Eli, bleeding on the floor. Clara trying to staunch the flow with her hands. Breen looked down at Eli. "Stone, I got your message. You always did know how to make an entrance." He looked at Clara. "And who, son, might you be?" Clara looked up, her face streaked with dirt and Eli's blood. Her hat was gone. Her short hair was matted. "My name," she said, her voice shaking but carrying through the silent, crowded church, "is Clara. I am not a boy, and I am not property." Mallory, in the grip of the marshal, laughed. "She's a runaway, Your Honor, a whore from an outpost. I have the paper. Subtle. He bought her." "Silence," Breen roared. He knelt, his hard eyes softening as he looked at Clara. "Tell me." And she did. She told them everything. She told them about her uncle, about the $50, about Subtle and Jed and Harlan, about the ropes. She told them about the cabin. She told them about Eli killing Jed to protect her. She told them about coming to Dustwood, and about Mallory's threat. "He's a liar," Mallory screamed. "She's a simple-minded girl. Subtle's paper proves—" "The paper proves nothing," Clara said, her voice rising. She stood up, her small, boyish figure trembling with a terrible, righteous fury. The townspeople murmured, their eyes wide. "You want proof?" she cried. "You want Subtle's contract?" In front of the judge, the marshals, and the entire town of Dustwood. Clara unbuttoned her filthy shirt. She tore at the binding, pulling it loose. "This," she said, her voice breaking, "is Subtle's proof." She held out her arms. In the bright, unforgiving light of the church, They all saw the raw, puckered, pink and white scars that circled her wrists, the brand of the rope. A woman in the crowd gasped. Another began to weep. The men, even the hardened ones, looked away, their faces dark with shame and anger. "This," Clara said, her voice a whisper that filled the sanctuary, "is Sheriff Mallory's law." Judge Breen's face was granite. He rose to his full, towering height. He looked at Mallory, his eyes blazing with a cold fire that was more terrifying than any rage. "Sheriff Mallory," he said, his voice a low, deadly thing. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, attempted murder, and dereliction of duty. You will be tried in my court, and God help your soul." He looked at the crowd. "As for the man Subtle, if he is in my jurisdiction, he will be found. He will hang." He turned back to Clara. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice gentle, "you are now, and forever, under the protection of the federal court. You are a free woman." Clara stared at him, the words not making sense. Then her knees buckled. Eli, who had been watching, his face pale as death, sagged, the relief too much. "Clara," he whispered, and he fell into darkness. They put him in a bed in the room above the mercantile, the same room the judge had taken as his own. The doctor, a nervous man who had avoided Mallory for years, dug the bullet out. It had shattered the bone, but it had missed his heart. He would live. He would never have full use of the arm, but he would live. Clara did not leave his side. She sat in a wooden chair, her disguise gone, wearing a clean dress one of the townswomen had given her. She sat for a day and a night, holding his good hand, watching him breathe. He woke in the middle of the second night. The room was dark, save for a single lantern. His eyes, fever bright, found her. You did it," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp. You showed them. You faced them. We did it," she whispered, her thumb rubbing the back of his hand. She leaned her head down, resting her cheek on their joined hands, her short hair brushing his arm. "Eli," she said, her voice so low he barely heard it. "Back at the gully, I told you I never wanted to belong to anyone." "I know," he said, his voice pained. I was telling the truth. I never wanted to be a man's anything, not ever again." She lifted her head, and her eyes, in the dim light, were shining, the tears finally coming. "I never wanted to belong to a man, until you—" His heart, which he thought was too broken to feel, ached with a sudden, sharp joy. He saw her, this woman of iron and tears, and he knew she had saved him, in every way a person could be saved. He lifted his good hand, his fingers weak, and he traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Clara," he said, and his voice was not the rasp of a wounded man, but the clear, sure voice of the man she had healed. "You don't belong to me." He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the misunderstanding. He shook his head, his gaze holding hers, a promise stronger than any law. "You belong to yourself. You earned that. You bled for it." He took a breath, the words the most important he would ever say. "But I will spend the rest of my life protecting what's yours." Weeks later, the high country air no longer smelled of snow and fear, but of warm pine and curing hay. Eli's shoulder had healed into a map of puckered, angry scars, a constant, dull ache that reminded him of what he had almost lost. His left arm was stiff, the muscles bound by the healed-over bone, but he could lift a saddle, he could hold a rein, he could hold Clara. That was all that mattered. Judge Breen had been as good as his word. He had held his court in Dustwood, and the town, emboldened by Mallory's arrest, had purged itself. Men and women who had lived in fear of the sheriff and his cronies had come forward. Subtle was apprehended 2 counties over, dragged back in irons, and tried alongside Mallory. Their contract for Clara was presented in court, and Breen had burned it in a metal bucket for all to see, declaring it an instrument of slavery. Both men were sentenced to hang. Eli's name was cleared. Judge Breen's telegraphs had flown. The authorities in Texas, re-examining the case of William Parker, had discovered the true killer was already in their jail, caught for another crime, and had confessed. Eli Stone was a free man. The town, in its gratitude, had given Eli the $500 bounty that Mallory had placed on his head, calling it justice. Eli had tried to refuse, the money feeling dirty, but Clara had taken it. "It's not blood money, Eli," she had told him, her voice quiet but firm. "It's our start. It's the price of our freedom. We will take it, and we will make it clean." They left Dustwood a week after the trial. They rode south, not running, but searching. They found it in a high, wide valley, 100 miles from any real town. A place where the mountains softened into rolling hills of aspen and thick grass. There was a cabin, a small, sturdy one, built by a trapper who had died of fever 2 winters before. The land was unclaimed. They filed for it at the county seat, using $200 of the bounty money. It was theirs. The cabin was small, just one room with a sleeping loft, but it had a stone fireplace and a solid roof. It was a palace. For the first month, they worked from sunup to sundown. Eli, his one good arm stronger than most men's 2, felled trees, mending the broken corral, his shoulders screaming in protest. But he never stopped. Clara, in her trousers, worked beside him, chinking the logs, planting a small garden, her hands, once scarred by ropes, now calloused by the axe and the hoe. One afternoon, Eli rode into the small settlement that served the valley, a place called Willow Creek, to buy salt and flour. He came back leading 2 horses. They were a pitiful sight. A gray mare, her ribs showing like a washboard, and a young roan gelding, favoring one leg. Both had the dull, dead eyes of animals that had given up. "Where?" Clara began, walking out of the cabin. "Miller's freight yard," Eli said, his voice grim. "He was going to shoot them, said they were useless. The mare is wind-broken, and the roan, he's been beaten." Clara approached them slowly. She held out her hand. The mare shied, her eyes wide with fear, pulling back against the rope. "It's all right," Clara whispered. "It's all right." She stood for a full minute, her hand out, unmoving, until the mare's fear was overcome by curiosity. The horse stretched her neck, her soft, gray nose finally touching Clara's palm. Clara stroked her touch light. "Look," Eli said, his voice low. Clara moved to the mare's side, and her hand went to the horse's neck, just below the mane. Her fingers found it, a long, hard ridge of scar tissue, hidden in the hair, a rope burn. Clara closed her eyes, her breath catching. She leaned her forehead against the horse's bony shoulder. She moved to the roan. He trembled, trying to back away, but he couldn't put weight on his bad leg. He, too, had the scars, but his were on his ankles, old and white, from a hobble that had been left on too long. They're like me," Clara whispered, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. Eli said nothing. He just watched her. She took the lead ropes from his hand. She led the 2 broken horses into the new corral, the one Eli had built. She took off their bridles. They stood, uncertain, their heads low, waiting for the next blow. Clara opened the gate. "Go on," she said, her voice soft. "Go!" The horses looked at her, then at the open gate, then back at her. They didn't understand. Clara stepped forward and gently slapped the mare's rump. "Go! You're free now!" Her voice broke on the last word. She leaned against the gate post, her shoulders shaking, and she wept. She wept for the broken, beaten animals, and for the broken, beaten girl she had been. She wept for the pain of the world, and for the hope of healing. Eli came and stood behind her. He didn't speak. He just put his good arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest, holding her as she let go of the last of the poison. They lived. Their life was hard, the work endless. But it was theirs. They were 2 damaged people, and the scars did not just fade. They had arguments, moments where the past rose up like a sudden storm. One night, Eli, frustrated with his stiff arm, threw a piece of harness across the yard. I can't even fix this," he roared, his anger not at the leather, but at himself at his weakness. "So let me do it," Clara yelled back, her face white. "Why must you do everything? Why must you be the one who's strong? Because I have to protect you." "I don't need protecting," she shrieked, her own ghosts rising up. "I'm not a child. I'm not a thing to be guarded. I am your partner, not your burden." The word hung in the cold air between them, ugly and sharp. Eli's anger vanished, replaced by a terrible shame. "Clara, I didn't mean—" "Stop," she said, her voice trembling. "Just stop. I can't breathe when you do that. When you try to build a wall around me. I've had enough walls. I need air. I need to be seen as me, not as the girl you found at the creek." She turned and walked away, her back rigid. He didn't follow. He let her go. He sat on the porch, his head in his hands. Until the moon was high, he found her in the corral, her arms draped over the gray mare's back. The mare, now sleek and filling out, was nuzzling her hair. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet in the night. She didn't turn. I'm sorry," he said. I'm so used to being the one who breaks things. I don't know how to let things be whole. I'm still trying to fix you, and you're not broken." She turned, her face pale in the moonlight. "Neither are you, Eli." "But you have to let go of William. You have to let go of that rope, just like I have to let go of mine." He nodded, the truth of it settling on him, heavy and light all at once. I'll try." "So will I," she said. Their love was not easy. It was not the soft, sweet love of songs. It was raw, and it was honest. It was two people, day after day, choosing to see the best in each other, even when they were at their worst. It was unshakable, because it was built not on illusions, but on the hard, solid rock of their shared, broken past. The first snows had dusted the high peaks when Clara's birthday came. She had told him the date in passing, a thing she hadn't thought of in years. October 19th. She was 20 years old. She woke that morning to the smell of coffee, and something else. Smoke. Eli was not in the bed. She pulled on her boots and went outside. He was standing by the corral, his back to her, a small fire going. He was heating an iron. "Eli," she said, her voice sleepy. "What are you—" She stopped. Leaning against the corral fence was a new saddle. It was beautiful. Not a fancy, silver-studded thing, but a work saddle, built of rich, dark leather, strong and simple. "I traded for it," he said, not looking at her. "From that trapper, Silas. Used my old one, and some furs. It's beautiful. Eli, it's too much." "No, it's not," he said. He took the hot iron from the fire. It was a small, simple tool he had spent weeks shaping. It's not finished." He walked to the saddle, and with a steady hand, he pressed the hot iron into the leather of the fender. Smoke rose, the smell sharp and clean. He held it there for a moment, then pulled it away, branded into the leather. In two simple, clean letters were her initials, C.S. Clara stared. She touched the letters. They were still warm. She looked at him, her eyes wide, uncomprehending. "Clara?" "Stone," he said, his voice rough, his gaze fixed on the ground. If you'd have me, I know you don't want to belong, and you won't, not to me, but maybe we could belong together." She looked at the saddle. She looked at the brand. It was not a mark of ownership. It was not Suttle's rope. It was a mark of identity, of a name, a new name. She began to cry, not the wild, keening sobs of her past, but slow, silent, heavy tears of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She was crying, not from sadness, not from fear, but from the simple, shattering miracle of being seen, She launched herself at him, her arms wrapping around his neck, burying her face in his coat. "Yes," she wept. "Yes, yes." He held her, his good arm and his scarred one, both holding her tight, his face pressed into her short, soft hair. That night, they made love. It was not the desperate, urgent claiming of the gully. It was not the reverent, healing touch of the trapper's cabin. It was slow. It was quiet. They moved together by the low light of the fire, their bodies familiar, their scars known. There were no words. There was no need for them. It was a wordless promise. It was trust, given and returned. It was a prayer, spoken in a language of touch. It was two souls, scarred but not broken, healing each other. Again and again and again. Spring came, and the valley turned a shade of green so bright it hurt the eyes. The aspens were covered in new, trembling leaves. Clara's horses, the gray and the roan, were sleek and strong, their coats shining, their eyes bright. One morning, the sun warm on their backs, they rode out. Clara was on the roan, in her new saddle. Eli was on his buckskin. Her hair, which she had let grow, was loose, the wind catching it, pulling it back from her face. They rode to the top of the ridge. The valley spread out below them, a wide, open, beautiful world. They were, in every way, free. Clara stopped her horse and looked at him. His face was leaner than when she'd met him, the lines around his eyes deeper, but his gaze was clear. The ghosts were gone. She reached out, her hand resting on his. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "when you found me, I was just a thing, a scared animal. I was just waiting to die." She looked at him, her love for him so big it filled the whole wide sky. "You didn't just heal me, Eli, you gave me a life." Eli looked at her, at this woman of iron and grace, this woman who had saved him from a prison of his own making. He saw her, truly, not as the girl he had rescued, but as the woman who had, in turn, rescued him. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her calloused knuckles. He smiled, his eyes holding hers. "That's because you made me want to live mine. Thank you for listening to this story. We hope it touched your heart. We invite you to let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this, and be sure to share your thoughts with us in English.